Hello, Angular Orange here with an introduction tutorial on Angular. What we're going to do in this tutorial is we're going to show you how to build a single page application. I call this my basic example, and basically what it does is it displays an Angular application that has a root component, which I call the application component, and it has children components, which are called navigational component, product list component, and footer component. And basically it's the simplest application I could think of, which shows you how to tile a single page application using Angular components and takes you from the user interface design to actually thinking about what components and markup fragments you're going to have in your templates and how to construct based on that construct your backing objects in Angular. So when I look at this particular single page application, I say to myself, well, I do have an index.html. I do need a root component, which is called my application component, and I also might need some configuration data like a URL, and so what I do is I create my root component to be the base component of my component tree in my Angular application, and then what I do is I render some config information just to show you that I have a file that I could use for calling, configuring and calling web services and stuff, but we don't do anything complicated in this example. And then we create a header component, which I call a navigational component, and I color it and I render some text on there using some basic directive to show you a child of the root component. And then I have a product list component output where I use a dummy array I have in a file, and I iterate through a bunch of product descriptions. So I have a JSON file which has a couple of products, and each product has a description of the product, the price, the title, the description, and a phony image. And then I have a footer, and basically my job is to now build this application by saying, okay, I need a tree of components. I need these component templates to render this information with these particular colors. So I use WebStorm to create an Angular CLI project called Basic, and I go to the command line and I generate some components using the ng space generate, and the components that I identify based on my UI requirements. I need a root component with a particular, and I could color the backgrounds any color I want, but I also need a navigational component and a product list component and a footer component, and I need a product class to create a product object. I don't necessarily need it, but I'm going to be using classes in this example, and I want to build this thing with an object-oriented style, and I use a product service with a get products function in it that returns an array of those products. So this is my strategy in delivering the application. Now the product service can call a URL and make a REST JSON call, but we don't do that in this example because we just want to simplify it. The main goal of this basic example is to create the most basic single page application by tiling your web page with component templates. Okay, so and then I also do some other things architecturally in the project where I make sure I have a components, a service, and a config directory, and I in my config folder I have a URL config parameter which I display in the application component template just for fun. And so if I want to generate certain components, I use this ng generate command with Angular CLI to generate the components, and basically what that does is it does create the directory and the component under the directory. It creates a Jasmine spec file. It updates the application module with whatever it needs, and then also in my product service file that I create, I create my products with my JSON data. So my product is an array of JSON data, which are products, and each product has the ID, the title, description, etc. Okay, so let's go to the code example and see what we have here. So let me enter presentation mode real quick. Okay, so instead of going through and creating all the stuff, and I do this in one of our course examples, which I could point you to later on. But the bottom line is, when I use WebStorm and I create an Angular CLI project, I just call it basic. And basically what happens is, when I create this project, it generates all the resources for me. And the reason why I don't interactively do that for you is because it creates the node modules directory, which is pretty populated, and it takes a little bit of time. But the important thing to realize here is it creates an Angular CLI file, which describes my project name and where my resources are in the apps folder, and I have a root directory source, my distribution directory, where my build goes, and it points to an index.html file, which is where my single page application starts. This is the index.html, which has a corresponding style sheet, and this is the one that contains a custom tag which represents my root component of my Angular application. And then I have a main.ts file, which is a TypeScript driver which drives my Angular application. Everything else that's being generated, I'll briefly describe. The unit tests are driven by Karma, and there's a Karma config file here, and the end tests are driven by Protractor, so there's a config file here. You do have a package JSON file which gets created, which shows you some of your script commands. So you'll be using ng for Angular CLI, and you'll use npm start to start the server, and you'll use a build to build when you're ready to deploy. And your testing and your end-to-end test and your lint are done with these npm commands. But for now, let's focus on the starting of the server and ng to generate components, etc. And so basically these files are, this file here is really what I go to initially to determine what my single page application is made out of. So the bottom line is there is a main.ts driver file here, and if we look at that, that basically imports certain code from Angular and some packages. The enable prod mode imports from Angular core, and basically that is to enable production mode if your environment points to production. So right now we have an environment settings here which points to dev. So enable prod mode won't happen. But enable prod does shut off certain assertions and things that it might be used in development, and so we need those things in development because we'll be debugging this code for a while. And then there's a platform browser dynamic which is imported from an Angular package, and we use that to bootstrap our app module. Our app module is a class in our custom file called app.module. And so that is our custom module, which is getting bootstrapped. So now let's go to the application app module and take a look to see what that thing is made out of. Okay, so this is the start of our app module. It is a class which is exported, and it uses certain things that it needs to run the application module. So the first thing we need is an ng module from Angular Core, because we use an annotation ng module, and we use a browser module as well, and we have to import that. And this is everything that's needed to support Angular for the browser. And then we have declarations of an application component, a footer component, product list component, and navigational component. And so these are our custom components that we use within our application. Now there's a providers, which is a product service. That's my service that I'm listing as a provider, and I list this as a provider in my app module so I can inject it into my constructor in any component that might need the product service. And then when I bootstrap the application component, this tells me that this is my root component. So basically I see in my app module I have a bunch of components, and one of them is the root, and this is the one that points to the root component. So now what I need to do is go look at that root component. But before I do that, let me just show you very quickly that I've constructed my app. So I have a components directory, and I have a config directory and a service directory. My config directory has a URLs file. It just has a URL exported variable. And so that's not as important. I just wanted to show you how you can get a URL when you need to. And my service directory has a service in it. So let's just go right to the application. Now, one thing I want to point out is that I do have a root component, which is an application component. And every Angular application is a tree of components. So the only way to really see that navigation and product list and footer are children of the application is to look at the template. And the template, loosely speaking, the template drives the children, drives the relationships and the communication between the components, etc. So let's go and take a look at what our component looks like. Okay, so our root component basically says that we import an ng module, a component, and a view encapsulation from Angular Core, and we also import a dev URL from the config URLs file. Okay, now the component that I imported from Core is used as the annotation. It says that I have a selector called approot, and I have a template and a style URL, which is external. So I'm pointing to external files for the template and the style sheet. And I also point to a view encapsulation, which says none, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But basically that just basically says don't use Shadow DOM in the browser, and don't use individual styles scoping for each of the components, which we're probably going to have to change. And so one thing I want to point out is when you look at that selector, if you go back to the index.html, you'll see that that selector is embedded in the body tag. And so this is our root component, which drives the Angular application. This is our base component of the tree of components for the Angular application. Okay, and the application component basically has a content string and a dev URL string. And so When I instantiate this particular object, there'll be with values associated with it. So what a constructor does, in every, in the class of the application component, I define a constructor and I initialize the content and the dev URL of the object. So when the object gets instantiated, it has attributes with certain values. Okay, so now let's go to the template. The template displays the content. Now notice this particular syntax is a directive in the template which renders the content attribute value from the backing object. So it's being done here as well, and this can be called the interpolation directive, because you can put a complicated expression in there. So we'll refer to it as the an expression directive, expression evaluator directive, or a double curly bracket directive, or an interpolation directive. And notice the tags here are custom tags, and I'm going to define those custom tags. And the way I do that is by creating different components with different selectors. So let's suppose, so if you look at these three components, you'll see footer has a footer selector, navigation has a navigation selector, product list has a product list selector. Okay, so now the other thing I have to point out is that each component has its own style sheet. So for this particular application style sheet, I'm showing, I'm styling the body, the h1 tag, the div tag, and I'm doing styling for the other components as well. And that's how I'm going to color my different components, just for clarity. Okay, so in this root component I have an h1 tag, a div tag. In this style sheet I have an h1 tag and a div tag. Now the index.html also has a style sheet, and it has a background body as gold. And this application .css has a body attribute. The padding is padding the top. Now, before I complicate things, I just want to point out is there's different view encapsulation modes in the component, and different things will happen with these style sheets for the different view encapsulation modes. If there's no view encapsulation modes, all the styles get crunched up to the top of the header file and they start overriding each other. Depending on which browser and which implementation you're using, you'll see different behavior. If the default for the view encapsulation mode is emulated, so if we do this, this is probably the default of Angular. And basically what will happen there is some namespacing will happen in the DOM tree so that each style, the styles for each component will be embedded within, it will be namespaced so that each element is not part of the DOM of the whole application. So anyway, let's get back to what we wanted to do. So basically the content here coming out should show a certain thing. Now let me go to the application, because I think I'm rendering it somewhere, or I should be rendering it somewhere. Okay, so first of all, what I did was I did an ng serve here to start my application. And what happens is it starts a Webpack, EnglishCLI starts a server, and basically what happens is WebSockets are used to, and Webpack is used, and the files are watched, the TypeScript files are watched, and if any changes happen, the project gets rebuilt. So basically, basically the project gets rebuilt, and WebSockets re-render the browser. Okay, so let's go fire up a browser and see what happens. I go to localhost.4200 because that's where my package is being used. That is where my Webpack, my ng-serve is serving the application at localhost 4200. So now if you look at the application, you'll see that my background is gold, which was my index.html style sheet, and then I had a root component which had a dev URL being rendered as well as the content. Now if I look at the navigational component, I'm going to show its content, and it's going to have a component with a content attribute, etc. So notice my navigational component, we import component, we have an Angular core, we have a selector navigation, it has an external template and style sheet, and we have an export of a navigational component. And in the constructor, I basically define the content of the attribute to be this string. And in my template, all I do is I show the content in the h1 tag. In my style sheet, I color that h1 tag. In my footer, I do something very similar. It's just the selector's footer. I get an external template, external style sheet. I have a content attribute, and I define the content to be the footer. Now, the product list is a little bit different. I actually import a product service and a product from a product service file, and once again I have a selector, an external template, and style sheet, but in the product list component I have a products array, which is an array of type product, and in that what I do is the product service is a provider in my module, so I inject it into my constructor, and then I do a get products on that product service, and I define the content to be this string. Now products is an array, so in the product list template, what I do is I use directives to iterate through the products. This is an ng4 directive. I say let a product of products. And what I do is I iterate for each product in the array. I show the product title and the product description and the product price using the directive for displaying the values in the backing object. And then what I do is I basically have a product service which has a class with product attributes, and the product service has a get products function on it which turns an array of products, and the products is just a static array of JSON data, but I map that to and this map goes through the array and takes each element of the array and maps it to an instance of a product. So that's basically all I wanted to show you to render a particular simple example like this.